And it's about the concept that there is a cycle that we go through. As we're being strategic, we're developing strategic plans, and yes, there is a planning element to this still. We go through a cycle of insight and strategy development, which then comes back to testing and reflection. So if you think about that cycle, there is first of all a problem that you're trying to solve. So there is a process of data collection, of gaining insight into what that problem is. What is it that's not quite going as well as you want it to at the moment? Why are you not quite delivering the vision as clearly or as comprehensively as you might want to be?
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode.
Hello, and welcome to this week's episode, which is all about strategy as learning. Now, this is the third in a series of 4 episodes, which I'm talking about ways in which I think that independent schools can rethink their approach to strategy. So in the previous 2 episodes, I've talked about the continuum between planned and emergent strategy and how many schools would benefit from allowing a little bit more strategy to emerge from various different parts of the school rather than it being all planned in a kind of top-down approach. And then in the last episode, I talked about how you could benefit from keeping a stable core, so not making too many changes to the core of what you're doing, but encouraging a disruptive edge. So having that idea of disruptive meaning innovative, status quo changing, kind of evolving, agile approach to what you're doing as well. This time I'm talking about a related idea, which is about strategy as learning. Now, normally, most of us jump to think about strategy as being almost equivalent to planning. We think about strategy as needing to be logical, being rational, being scientific. We need to analyse data, analyse the situation, and then make the one right choice about what the strategy should be and then implement it. Anyone who has tried to develop strategy and then implement it knows it isn't like that. It isn't possible to have all of the information and to be scientific in that way. So instead, what I'm going to talk about today is the idea of what happens if we change our approach, if we think about strategy as a learning process rather than a planning process. Now, the advantage here is obviously we're talking about strategy for schools. So this is what you do. Learning is a key part of one of your specialities. So thinking about how can we harness that love of learning, that idea of understanding learning and how it works to boost our strategies. So many people have told me that this podcast helps them, which is great because helping people is why I create these weekly episodes. And I also hear from lots of people who need a bit more support. For those schools, I facilitate strategy away days for governors and leadership teams. I guide heads and chairs of governors through the creation and implementation of new strategic plans. And I lead regular one-to-one strategy advice calls with heads and directors of development. And the best part of my job is hearing from the people I work with that they're clearer about what to prioritise day to day. They're better able to lead change in their schools, and they feel happier and more confident that they're making good strategic decisions. So anytime that you feel like you need a bit of extra help, just drop me a message so we can chat. You'll find my contact details at www.consultjuliette.co.uk. Okay, so the traditional view of strategy is that it's a planning process. But there's a number of problems with that approach. And one of them is that we are never going to have enough data about what's happening that allows us to be purely scientific in our approach. So we can collect all the data we can and there will still be gaps in our knowledge and understanding about what's happening at the moment, which makes it very difficult to think about strategy as being finding the one right answer from a whole plethora of data. Data is important, but it's not enough. The other problem with thinking about strategy as planning is that you never know what's going to change. Your external environment can change, your competitor actions might influence your strategy. It's possible that you might, even if you do find the one right answer through an immaculate planning process today, by next week it could be completely out of date because things have changed around you. And I think the final reason why strategy as planning isn't a fully comprehensive way of understanding strategy is that we're talking about organisations made up of people. People are beautifully unpredictable. It's very hard to really understand in a planning way or using a planning lens how people interact with each other, how the communities that you're leading will evolve over time, the individual characteristics of leaders, of people who are leading in each department, for example, the relationships between those individuals. It's a little bit like an economist saying, and I studied economics so I know, saying I've got all the data so I can predict what happens next. And I'm thinking, well, unless you have the most stellar understanding of psychology of every single person involved in your model, there will always be a big part of that is an unknown system because we're talking about human beings. And so there is a big risk when we think about strategy as just a planning process. We're almost setting ourselves up for failure because if we really think that we can plan once and then blindly implement, it's just not going to work. So strategy is about planning in my point of view, but it's not just about planning. And I think this is where strategy as learning, looking at strategy through a lens of thinking, what did we learn as we go through the process of strategy development and strategy implementation? This provides us another perspective on strategy, which I think is really important to explore. And this is one of the reasons why I think we need to rethink our approach to strategy in this area as independent schools. So let's think a little bit more. What do we mean by the idea of strategy as learning? So this is something which is thought about and talked about a lot within academic circles. And it's about the concept that there is a cycle that we go through. As we're being strategic, we're developing strategic plans, and yes, there is a planning element to this still. We go through a cycle of insight and strategy development, which then comes back to testing and reflection. So if you think about that cycle, there is first of all a problem that you're trying to solve. So there is a process of data collection, of gaining insight into what that problem is. What is it that's not quite going as well as you want it to at the moment? Why are you not quite delivering the vision as clearly or as comprehensively as you might want to be? Gaining that insight, doing the analysis. I often talk about accelerators and sticking points at this time, kind of a SWOT analysis, a PESTEL analysis, understanding what's going on, getting that insight to what's happening. You then go into a stage of strategy development. So then part of the cycle is where you're thinking about strategies which help you to overcome those problems that you're facing. At the end of that strategy development process, you're not actually creating the right plan, the one single right plan that emerges from that data. Instead, what you're doing is you're creating a hypothesis. And I like this idea that strategy is a hypothesis, so an idea that you can test. And if we say that, okay, we've created a hypothesis for what we think the problem is through our process of generating insight, we've created a hypothesis of what we think the solution is through our strategy development, then naturally the next stage is going to be, let's test our hypothesis. It's not, we found the one right answer, now we just need to implement it and all of our problems disappear. It's, how can we test this hypothesis that we've identified the right challenges, that we've identified the right solutions? When you're in that frame of mind, you then think about, okay, naturally you want to test your hypothesis, you want to put some of those solutions into action, you want to implement those solutions, but you constantly want to check and see what's happening. You want to learn about what's happening along the way. So in this process, the next stage in that cycle we're thinking about Might be to implement some pilot projects, might be to really strategically do some trial and error projects to see what's working. Think about how you can do some small scale, low risk ways of solving the problem that give you information, that give you ways that you can refine your hypothesis of your solutions over time. And the aim of this cycle is then, having tried a few things out, learned about what might work, what might not work, what have you discovered along the way. Nothing is a failure. When you're thinking about learning, it's all around, okay, something hasn't quite gone to plan. What did we learn? And if you learn from that process, it's not a failure. And that's what we tell our young people all the time. It's not about failing, it's about learning. So if you think about that cycle, having implemented some of your solutions, you're constantly reflecting on what's working and what's not working. You refine your insight into the problem, and you go around that cycle again through strategy development, thinking about some more small scale ideas that you can test, scaling up some of those pilots that maybe worked. And it's a constant cycle of learning as you go, finding out what works, finding out what doesn't work, and refining your process over time. Now, what I love about this idea is that this is a fantastic way to boost the ability that your school has at all levels, all different people, to think and act strategically. And I often talk about the fact that strategic plans, they're great. They're a means of communication. That's fine. But what really matters is that you can think and act strategically as a team, as a school community. So this approach to strategy as learning takes a completely different point of view. It's not about a kind of a 5-year cycle. It's about a continually changing, shifting cycle, maybe termly, or at least once a year. Now, if this is appealing to you, if you're thinking, okay, there are things in here that I can understand from my department, or I can understand from my school, are going to be really helpful, what can I do with this information? So I've got a couple of things that you can actively do to encourage people to understand strategy as learning. So first of all, it's all about encouraging innovative ideas that deliver the strategic direction. So a little bit like we've talked about in a couple of previous episodes, it's about being really clear about what your direction is, what your vision is, what your values are, but then encouraging other people across the entire school to innovate, to create ideas that take you in that general direction. You then need to put in place a system for collecting what those ideas might be, deciding which ones you're going to test. So there might be some investment involved in some of these. You have to have a process for signing off on which ideas you're going to test. You need to have a way of building in reflection time. So this learning process involves time to collect some of the data on some of these pilots that you might be running, to identify the time that you can take to analyse that data, to collect viewpoints across the different people who've been involved, the impact on pupils. You need to build in time for that reflection. Is that going to happen termly? Is that going to happen annually? You might have a different time frame for different projects, but you need to have a structure for how you're going to do that. And then you need to build in flexibility so that you can adjust your strategic plan as you go. So if you're embracing this idea of strategy as learning, you're embracing this idea of emergent strategy, as we've talked about in previous episodes, you need to have a culture which enables governors to have a mindset of, we expect things to change, we want things to change on an annual basis or as we go along in an agile way. And so when you go to a governor's meeting, you say, right, that one didn't quite work out as we planned, but we're shifting and changing. You want the governors to have a mindset of, that's not a failure. This is strategy as learning. That's really good that we tried it. It's really good that we learnt from it. And what's most important, what are we planning to do next about it? When you work in this way, what you want the strategic plan to do is to set out the general direction and vision, and then you want to enable your school for these ideas to bubble up from wherever they bubble up across your community. And that's the way that I work with schools. Yes, I do work with governors and senior leadership teams on annual strategy away days, but those workshops are about being agile, working out what's working right now, what do we need to change and tweak over time. It's not about creating a one rigid strategic plan. It's about learning the skill of strategic thinking and learning to think and act strategically as a school. one final thought for you, and this is something that I'm going to leave you with to think about. There is a school of thought within management which talks about the learning organisation. And they define this as an organisation that is capable of continual regeneration from the variety of knowledge, experience and skills within a culture that encourages questioning and challenge. Now, as always with academic definitions, that's pretty lengthy, but the basic idea is if you're going to create a learning organisation, there is a constant cycle of regeneration. There is a constant cycle of idea generation, testing, reflection, and then implementation of the next refined version of that idea. There's constant questioning, constant challenge within a constructive way that allows everybody to elevate what they're doing on a regular basis. Now, as schools, we already know that we're learning organisations in the sense that part of our core vision is for our pupils to be learning. I frequently speak with leaders within schools about how they want their staff to be constantly learning as well. What happens if we define the whole school as a learning organisation? The culture needs to be one of continual learning and refinement and elevation over time. Isn't that what we're all here to create? As always, if you want any more support, then just get in touch. And I do encourage you to download my Rethinking Strategy in Independent Schools research report as well, if you're interested in thinking about this in a little bit more detail. And the link for that is in the episode notes. So that's it for this week. I'll be back with you again next week with my final instalment of Rethinking Strategy. And in the meantime, have a great week. Bye-bye then.
Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.